Professor Nath, there's some noise from your end. Could you just? Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 5 of Cogito's SciComm for Scientists workshop. I am Aditya Dwarkesh, a student at IISA Kolkata. I have just completed my second year of BSMS and I am studying mathematics. I will be moderating today's session. Today's event is going to be on scientific communication in the vernacular languages. Um, Cogito is very grateful to the speakers for taking the time out to be a part of this workshop. The sequence of the talks that we will follow shall be, we shall first have Professor Pal speak on communicating science in the vernacular languages, following which we will have Mr. Sharma speak, and thirdly, Professor Nath, who will speak on challenges in science communication in the vernacular. So I'll introduce all the speakers, and after that I'll give the floor to Professor Pal. So Professor Pal is a physicist who specializes in theoretical particle physics. He retired from the Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics in 2017 and is currently an emeritus professor in the physics department of Calcutta University. He has been enthusiastically communicating science to the masses for more than 3 decades through books, articles, and talks. He was the recipient of the Rabindra Smriti Puroskar in 2004 and the Ramendra Sundar Smriti Puroskar in 2011 for his writings in science. Dr. Kollegala Sharma has been communicating science in Kannada, one of the native tongues of India, for over 40 years. He was the chief scientist at CSIR CFTRI, Mysuru, until his retirement, and has published 2,000 popular science articles, 78 radio dramas, and taught at tens of SciComm workshops. Professor Nath is a physicist who specializes in cosmology. He joined the Raman Research Institute, Bangalore, in 1997 and has been there since. He has been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute, Bonn, Germany, as an Alexander von Humboldt professor in 2000, a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford, UK in 2000, and a visiting professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder in USA in 2004 to 2005. With this, I would like to offer the floor to Professor Pal to begin the proceedings of the day.
Okay, thank you. When I say you, I mean all of the organizers for inviting me to give this talk to an audience whom I do not see. But this is the new normal, so we have to get used to it. Let me just turn on the presentation so that I can continue with my talk. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the official title of my talk is The Three Horizons of Terminologies for Indian Languages, and what I mean by three horizons I will explain as I go along. First of all, I should, maybe it's just irrelevant or superfluous at least, not irrelevant but superfluous, to say what a terminology is. Terminology is the collection of terminological words that doesn't say much. These are words or phrases which have restricted use in a language on topics which do not concern everyone but is limited in its use to some particular subject of discussion. And they are created in at least two different ways. a single person working on a certain discipline, when he or she encounters a new object or a new idea, comes up with a new idea, gives the name to the idea. Sometimes other people give the name to the person's idea, or a committee created by the government or a university or some such organization, they can assess the terms which exist and then modify them if necessary, and also suggest new things. So the problem is that whenever this is done in what has been called vernacular languages in the name of this session, a name which I particularly don't like, but anyway, whenever this is done and you write something, oh, there will be dozens of people who will come and say, oh, these terms that you have used, I have lost 2 of my teeth when I was reading your article. They just fell. So this is the problem. But let us go through the process of assigning these names and try to understand what is going on. So how do people assign these names? When a person or a committee faces this situation in the context of Indian languages, and I will also talk in the context of science mostly, and in science my knowledge about biosciences is less than 0 really. So mostly the examples will be from physical sciences or mathematics, but the comments are not restricted to them. So they have the following options when they are asked to choose a word. Let's go through them one by one. They can choose a word from just common parlance. They can use a Sanskrit word or a word derived from Sanskrit, use English or words from other countries which enter through English, or use hints from other modern Indian languages. So I use a geographical metaphor in which the first option will be called the mainland, and the other 3 are the horizons of this mainland. And with the given time, I may not go through all the 3 horizons, but I at least will try to go through the first 2, and then we'll decide on the third depending on the time. So first the mainland, of course, taking word from common parlance. Now this should be the most obvious way, or even the only way. So why do we even need to discuss other alternatives? Well, the problem is names of some objects exist in common parlance, but names of ideas usually do not. And names of unusual objects also do not exist in common parlance. So there might be a common word for iron ore, for example, but definitely for iron sulfate, or definitely none for determinism or things like that. Number 2, the words might be confused with the loose meanings that exist in common parlance. I will give examples of that later. Number 3, very common words may not have the grammatical flexibility that is needed for a terminological word. Let's consider the following words. There is a verb for describing the happening of a process. For example, let's say crystallize. A noun for the name of the process, crystallization. An adjective for something that has undergone the process, crystallized. Unless all these words can be derived from the same grammatical root, the connection between them will not be obvious, and the terminologies will be difficult. So, very rarely the mainland is suitable for terminological words, because many languages do not have very much of this flexibility. So let us look at the first horizon, Sanskrit. Sanskrit is excellent in terms of this flexibility. So if one chooses to look up to Sanskrit words for a term, what does he or she do? Well, method 1, pick a familiar Sanskrit word. So this is almost like choosing the mainland coinage. Of course, you can ask, if the word is familiar, why would it need to be picked or coined? The point is, even a familiar word used as a term has to have a very special and precise meaning that the usual word might not have in the main body of the language. For example, in English, stress and strain means roughly the same in the English language, but in physics they mean something very, very different. Example for Sanskrit, Shakti. These Sanskrit words I will probably pronounce in somewhere in between Sanskrit and Bengali. If anybody has difficulty in understand, please look at the screen and not hear my pronunciation. So example for Sanskrit is Shakti and Kshamata or Khamata. These are almost synonyms in Bengali, except in physics books. So this is the kind of thing that I was talking about before, that there has to be precise meaning attached to the words when you use them for terminology, which the common parlance words do not have. So words have to be given specific meanings, and no synonyms would be allowed. Method 2, pick an unfamiliar Sanskrit word. So the basic idea is, well, just what I said. Use a Sanskrit word which was not in frequent use in a modern language and use it with a special terminological meaning close to the original Sanskrit meaning. So in the late 19th century, some Bengali authors suggested using Bayu to mean gas. This created problems. So Ramendra Sundar Trivedi, a famous Bengali writer and a pioneer in this field, he suggested Anil. Anil is a word for Bayu. So he said, why not use Anil for gas? Because we never use Anil in our spoken Bengali. But meanwhile, gas in itself became a household word because of gas lights on the streets. So it was not really necessary. We started using gas. Some other suggestions by the same person, Salil for fluid. It has not been used, but that's a shame. It should have been used. Some successful examples, not necessarily from science. Culture was translated as Sanskriti in Bengali in early 20th, which was not used before in Bengali at all. Energy was translated as Urja in Hindi in 21st century. It was only a dictionary word, nothing more than that. Takat was the common Hindi word. There is a method 3, namely create a new word. Actually, this is the most powerful method, and let us start with an example. Galileo argued that all speeds are relative, one cannot define or measure absolute speed. Albert Einstein used it as a postulate for a theory called the theory of relativity. Now, how do you translate relativity? In Bengali and probably in some other Indian languages, the word is apekkhikata or apekshikata. The word never existed in Sanskrit because the associated idea did not exist. And yet, it is a Sanskrit word. Why? So, the basic question is, how can you create a new word in Sanskrit which did not exist in Sanskrit? And how can they have a specific meaning? Well, the point is, let's venture a little bit into linguistics, semantics in particular. The basic units of meaning are not necessarily words. They are called morphemes in linguistics. Examples, if you take rudeness, it is one word, but it has two morphemes. Rude is an independent word as well, and also a morpheme. Such morphemes are called free morphemes. And the ness, that is an example of a bound morpheme, which conveys a meaning but cannot be used as a word. Now, one can use existing morphemes, in particular the bound morphemes, they're the most important things, and existing rules of joining morphemes to create words which did not exist earlier. So, apekhikata was apekha, was a free morpheme, and then ik and ta, they were bound morphemes. From apekha you go to an adjective which is apekhik, and then ta you make it noun again. So how does one coin new words? We will assume that the word already exists in some other language. For example, let's say it exists in English, and we want to translate it in some sense. So method 3, we are discussing method 3, creating a new word. Divide the word into morphemes. Find the closest approximation to each morpheme and join them together. Example, telescope. It contains two morphemes. Tele from Greek means far. Dur in Bangla. Skopos from Greek means vision. Bikkhon or Bikshon, a non-colloquial word, a dictionary word in Bangla. So together they made Durbikkhon or Durbikshan. Now once created, the success of the word will be determined by whether the same translation of the two morphemes can be used in other words. For example, in English, tele was used in telephone, television, telepathy, scopos as in spectroscopy, ophthalmoscopy, laparoscopy, and so on. But there are problems with the method. Number one, some morphemes may not have an easy equivalent. For example, the dis, it's a bound morpheme, as in disproved. Just a negative morpheme is not good enough, because disproved does not mean not proved. It's something different. Now, some morphemes may not have been uniform uses in the source language. For example, English created a mess with the morpheme pathy. Myopathy, here pathy means sickness. Homeopathy hardly means sickness. Don't ever mention that to a homeopathic doctor. He will be completely, totally angry with you. Here pathy means a system. Telepathy, here pathy means connection. It's a mess. And then problem number 3, for some words, morphemic translation would only uncover failed ideas. For example, hydrogen, from Greek, hudor and genus, something that creates water. Similarly, oxygen, something that creates acid. But now we know oxygen is not a constituent. Oxygen is first of all also a constituent of water. So while oxygen Udojan or Omlojan, which was tried in Bengali more than 100 years ago, they are not really desirable and even should be avoided. Just an overview at this point, almost halfway through, which contains things we have discussed and things we will discuss. A new term, there are 3 ways. You accept a familiar word, you revive an unfamiliar word, or you create a new word. And creating new word, there are 3 ways. There is a morphemic translation, which we have discussed, and the other 2 we will discuss now. One is approximate the meaning, and the third one is phonetic approximation. So, the second option. In this method, excuse me, rather than analyzing the morphemes, one tries to understand the usage of the whole word and then tries to find a suitable word in the receiving language. For example, series of numbers like 1, 4, 7, 10, 13 is called arithmetic progression. series like 1, 4, 16, 64 is called geometric progression. Why arithmetic? Why geometry? These are completely, bad names. I probably should have used a more, forceful adjective, but I forbade myself from doing so, which took a little time. So, in the first kind, the difference between successive terms is constant. In the second, the ratio is constant. In Bengali, the first kind is called Shamantar Shreni. Shamantar, Shama, Antar, equal, interval. The second is called Gunottar Shreni, obtained by gun or multiplication, which express the definitions quite well. Similarly, disprove can be, rather than this morphemic translation, we can just say khandan. This was used by Nyaya logicians. Or black hole can be andhakup, which is a word which is not very uncommon. Method 3, option C. Here one tries to make a word in the receiving language that is phonetically similar to the original word, irrespective of its meaning. So in 19th century, some authors in Bengali preferred nitrogen for nitrogen, acetylene for acetylene, and so on. It may sound crazy, but it's not so much crazy if one recalls that it is the commonest method of absorbing words from other languages. Apple has become apple in Bengali, table has become tebil in Bengali, and so on. And it has successfully happened for some scientific terms as well. For example, Röntgen rays have become Ranjan Roshi. Now, for words like table or apple, this is innocuous because the transformed pronunciation did not have any meaning in Bengali. For words like nitrogen, there are potential problems since the words suggest a meaning that is different from the intended one. Netro means eye and John means person. So the combination has nothing to do with the gas that is the major constituent of air. That is the problem. So, let us look at the horizon 2, English. Now, some people think that this is the only horizon that one should look at. All terminological words should be borrowed directly from English by mere transliteration. And anyone who looks at any other alternative is a complete is doing mindless conservatism or just cowardice, and these people just promote parochialism where internationalism should be the goal. It is true, mindless conservatism is bad, but foolish adventurism is also not good. Cowardice is bad, but violence in the name of strength is also not good. Let us think the option carefully, what is done. So first of all, the question, which words are terminological words and which are not? How do you distinguish them? How will you translate the following sentence into an Indian language? If we increase the pressure of a solid substance, how will that affect the relation between its temperature and volume? Is solid a terminological word? Is increase a terminological word? Even before, let's say, to understand the difficulty in answering this question, consider the names of chemical elements. Say radium, uranium, tungsten, definitely terminological words, otherwise meaningless, and we should use transliterated forms. I don't think anybody will dispute about that. Oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, the English names are bad, as I have already said, but still use them. Iron, gold, silver, are they terminological words? Well, definitely not. So let's look at their case. We might decide to use the words available for them in our language, say loha, rupo, shona in Bengali, or loha, chadi, sona in Hindi. But the problem does not end there. What do you do for silver nitrate? Presumably everyone will agree that the nitrate part should remain. Should then silver also remain in the names? Or would you say rupo nitrate, chadi nitrate, and so on? In case of iron, it's worse. because even in English, the names of iron compounds start not with iron but with ferrous or ferric. In fact, English is not international enough in this regard. The truly international names for elements are their chemical symbols. So then, why shouldn't we use ferrum, organtum, aurum, which are close to the symbols Fe, Ag, Au? Make terminology only difficult. Now, the case of light. No one will claim that light is a scientific term. The common Bengali word is alo. I mean, when I say light, I don't mean light and heavy in that sense, but light as a form of energy. The common Bengali word is alo, a shortened form of the Sanskrit word alok. But we need to use the word in combination with other morphemes to describe physical properties of light. Should we use light then, as in the case of nitrate and so on? There are two problems. Number one, the word light is used in Bengali in common parlance actually, but in the related sense of source of light. For example, we say tube light. Now, will there be a conflict if we start using light in the sense of alo actually? And secondly, in English terminology, light is not always used to denote light. For example, photography, photosynthesis, photon. So, in order to appropriate light from English, should we have to appropriate the Greek stem photos as well? So, the question is it wise to import words where we already have words? And if we do, will it make our terminologies easier or more difficult? Suniti Kumar Chattopadhyay, the very famous Bengali linguist, once said or wrote actually, selenoid, bakelite, paraffin, petrol, asbestos, these are words for which it is difficult to find a Bangla equivalent, and we don't feel bad if we cannot. But if we do not find a phrase from Bangla root words to mean air raid, then it seems that we are admitting that our language is crippled. Of course, air raid is not a technical word, scientific, not in scientific terminology, but in the same spirit. Consider laws of motion or natural selection. I mean, all of these words used here are ordinary words. Should we have to use them in toto English? Now, at the morphemic level, the question is more poignant. Suppose, even for argument's sake, that we have decided to absorb the word reflection in our language. What will happen to reflect it? Reflectivity. Take them as well? Or treat reflection now as a root word and inflect it by the rules of our language using bound morphemes? Now, hardened English lovers will probably say, well, use them. Why not use reflection, reflected, reflectivity, and maybe more? Here is what's wrong. The task of a language is to convey information. The relation between different words is conveyed by their morphemic structure. If you kill that structure, language becomes more difficult to understand. I will show later more. Terminology constitutes a part of language, and the comment above applies to terminologies as well. So, for example, suppose we have taken the word iron. What do we use for ionized? In Bengali textbook, they say ionito, using the Bengali morpheme. And it's much better. People don't have to learn ionized also. Once they have learned iron, they have learned ionito. The more one uses known morphemes, it is easier to understand the words. Consider a native English speaker encountering the word alloy for the first time, and a native Hindi speaker encountering Mishra Dhatu. The first one has to learn the word, the second one needs no effort in understanding the concept. That's the advantage. There are actually different kinds of words which we should distinguish at this point. There are root words and derived words. Now, the point is, a derived word is in some sense solvable, namely that we can guess the meaning by seeing the word, and that helps. So, consider oxygen. What to do with oxidation, oxidative? In Bengali, considering the difficulty, it was decided to sever the morphemic relation between oxygen and oxidation and call the latter word, oxidation, as jaron. One has to learn it. But then it easily follows that oxidized is jarito, oxidative is jarondharmi. Now, if the English lover thinks that we should have taken the words derived from oxygen as well, let me ask whether the meanings of the derived words are easy even in English. So fill in the following gaps. From oxygen you make oxidized and oxidative. From hydrogen, what do you do? From nitrogen, what do you do? There are not easy answer. The point is that oxidative is a root word for all practical purposes, even to an English speaker. Jarondharmi is not so to a Bengali speaker. And this is the problem. English has too many root words in its terminology. Remember alloy. Here are some more examples. Division, bhag. Quotient. In Bengali it's bhag phal. Quotient, you have to learn a new word. Remainder, bhag shesh. Diameter, radius. In Bengali, bash, bashardho. Molecule, atom, onu, paromanu. Circle, ellipse, parabola, britto, upabritto, parabritto. Mass, speed, bhor, beg, and then momentum in Bengali is bhorbeg. So, quotient, you have to learn a new word, and so on and so forth. Ellipse, that's a new word, but in Bengali you don't have to learn a new word. And that's why those things are easy. So the advantage of using derived words can be seen with some other examples. Bacteria, in Bengali is jibanu. The Bengali reader immediately understands the word. An English reader has to learn it. Atom, paromanu. Arthropod, I could never remember this word, and that's one of the reasons I did not study biology in my higher secondary. But in Bengali it's called Sandipod, very easy. Marsupial, Onkogarbho. Cotyledon, Bijpatro. I never understood what cotyledon is until I learned the Bengali word, and so on. Now, very staunch English lovers might say that arthropod and cotyledon sounds perfectly easy to them. Partially, this is because we learned English, all English words from books. We think speed and velocity are on equal footing in English. We think backache, rheumatism and arthritis are interchangeable words. They are not to an English reader. And words like refraction, which in normal English is called bending, or diffraction, which is normal in English has no words for it, are used in physics terminology. Besides, why shouldn't we strive to do better than English in certain cases? For example, arithmetical progression we have discussed earlier, samantar sreni. Photosynthesis, in Bengali we say shalok shansleshan. It starts with the sa, shalok. That sa means with. In English, from the word you do not understand whether you are synthesizing light or you are synthesizing something else with light. In the Bengali word, it's obvious that you are synthesizing something else with light. Interference. Coinages like constructive interferences sounds like oxymorons. Bengali words, the Bengali word batichar is much better and uses familiar morphemes. So anyway, my time is up, and as predicted, I could not go to the third horizon, but the third horizon can be summarized in one sentence, that Indian languages should look at one another while discussing their terminologies, and unfortunately it has not been done. So that is a pity. And Indian languages should also look beyond the border. For example, Bengali is not just an Indian language. Punjabi is not just an Indian language. So we need to discuss these things with in case of Bengali with experts in Bangladesh, in case of Hindi Urdu or Punjabi with experts in Pakistan, and so on. So this is the end of the talk. There is one more slide which I am just leaving for you, but thank you very much for your patience.
So thank you, Professor Pal, for the wonderful talk. We won't open up for questions right now, so we'll finish the next two talks and then we will allow for questions simultaneously. So without much ado, let's move on to Mr. Sharma's talk. Next.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you, Professor Ball. Actually, a lot of things that we needed to discuss has already been spoken about here. The problems in different languages, whether it is Bengali or Kannada, are not much different. There are only some nuances we find as different between the two languages. For example, when you discuss whether we derive a word from Sanskrit or from English or from a Latin word or from the Kannada roots, so the problems that we face are almost similar in all the languages, but there are some differences. I will not go into these details because one problem with most of my colleagues, as well as some of my friends who want to write in English but who don't, is that they focus more on this problem of creating new words, whereas the purpose of communication is communication. I'm not saying that what Dr. Ball so far discussed is not important. It is the most important thing that one need to learn. But before we do that, we go into the details, micro details like that, and then start doing things. It is very much essential that we start communicating in Indian languages. So the first question most people will ask again is why? Why don't you write in English and why do you write in Kannada? For those people, my answer is that I can do in both languages. So whereas a lot of people can do that in English, there are very few people who can do that in Kannada. And therefore, I would like to be a person who can add to the Kannada vocabulary, who can add to the Kannada literature something from science. This is very important because if you look at the scenario today in India, whether it is Bihar, UP, Telangana, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, or even Karnataka, almost 70% of post-metric students, I would still call everybody as a student who has passed 10th standard, students have to depend on a local Kannada media for any information related to science. This is mainly because the competency in English is low in most of them. Second thing is a fear of English is there. The third thing is local media is very easily available to them. But if someone wants to know what is a corona, what is a COVID, and to find the difference between these two, it's very difficult in the Kannada medium to get the information. That is the most problem. You can Google, but then the Google returns you only answers in English. And for the past 3-4 years, probably I've been able to Google in Kannada and get some information, but still that information is not enough. So one of the main things that I'm very worried is that of the future, what will happen to the digital divide that we are talking about? Will it be broader, much wider, or will it disappear? I have my own doubts about that. It is not the access to the tools, access to the internet, access to this thing, but the divide would be much, much stronger in case of Indian language users. The only users or the users of only Indian language, because a lot of information is not available on the net for them to get. So this is one of the reasons why I focus more on Kannada, and I have been doing this in several ways. And one of the easiest thing to do is to start speaking, start talking about these things, forgetting about the specific words. So once you do that, because there are two things that we need to understand. There are different levels of communication. I would, depending upon who your audience is. And in science communication, we look at two things. What Dr. Paul said, in most of the cases, would be if we want to talk about science to our peer group. And if we want to talk science to a group which has no inclination towards science, then the strategy has to be different. And there we have to start from the language that they know, the words that they understand, and the sounds that they like. And so therefore there is a difference between the kind of words that we use in a paper that I write for a audience who are very familiar with science, and for an audience who is not familiar with the science aspect. So these are two things that we need to understand. Probably in earlier sessions you have already listened to many of the experts talking about the communication and how you start from the familiarity to the unfamiliar territory. But then you may ask me another question. The question is, sir, you have been telling us that, I have been there for the last 40 years, and what is your impact or achievement? Well, that is something I cannot measure, except I can give you some anecdotal examples of what happens if you write in Indian languages. One of these happened last year when the COVID started, or the corona pandemic started across the world. I found one day on WhatsApp. Of course, WhatsApp is the new media, and Facebook is its brother, and Twitter is, of course, a familiar family. So WhatsApp, I got a message not from one group. It came from almost all the groups. Almost all the groups. It was a small bit of paper of a magazine, and it was burnt almost half of that. And there was only one paragraph left, and the message said that long back in 1989, Indians had already knew about coronavirus. Okay, and it was also published in a Kannada magazine. So I was very much thrilled to see that. Thrilled because, not because it was a something news that Indians had already done something, or the Kannadigas had done something, but because the article was written by me when I was a student. And the story goes like this. I used to have a lot of discussions with a lot of people about, I had my own views of communicating science. And one of the things was that, see, no topic is difficult to communicate. That is the first thing that I would say. If you say that, okay, sir, I am working in molecular biology, I'm working in theoretical physics, it is very difficult for us to talk about these things, I would say that, no, that is not correct. So we will have to find a way. There is a way of even talking about the most difficult of the topics to an audience. And this is what I was thinking, and I used to argue about these things. So one of the editors threw a challenge to me. He said, look, I was then a research scholar in the Kasturba Medical College doing radiation biology. And he threw a challenge saying that there are so many things in the medical world that come up, but nobody knows about that because doctors don't write about it, and they are not interesting to the audience. So this was something that struck me. Unless you have a cancer or you have something else, the common diseases are not of interest to people. So I told him, I took the challenge and said that, okay, I will write an article, will you publish it? He said yes. So I wrote one on cold, nothing but cold, common cold. And fortunately, I had a good library and a lot of friends in the medical world, so I could gather a lot of information and do that. One of the information was about corona. The coronavirus was had been discovered only about 20 years back, and that was in the news at that time. So I wrote about that in a paragraph, that this is another of those viruses which cause symptoms like cold in us, and that's what the paper was carrying. That little bit, the bit of paper that came through WhatsApp was that paragraph which I had written. And I was surprised because after some time the editors called me. There were lots of newspapers which found out that I had written that article. So they started asking me, how did you know about corona and all? Did you already predict that corona will come? And, say there were already WhatsApp messages saying that there was a book written in English which predicted all this science fiction and all. So these are the things that can impact people. This is one example of how a small write-up, it was not a small write-up anyway, a write-up in Kannada can impact a large number of people. And the information subsequently about cold, the old article was retrieved, it was republished by the magazine, and a lot of people distributed it. But that's how the science communication happens. Two things I learned from this lesson. One, science communication happens if the audience is interested. If the audience is not interested in the topic, then you have to create the interest. That is where the challenge lies. Once you create the interest, then the communication becomes much, much easier. So the first challenge for any communicator is to create that interest in your language to the people. And that is the thing. Doing some magic is easier to create that interest, but explaining that magic is what is we are talking about. Explaining the magic in Indian language, Kannada, Bengali, Telugu, Hindi, is the challenge. Because the next topic is how the challenges of communicating science. Probably I have to leave a lot more things for my colleague to speak about also. Whereas what I find is that this is an important aspect in India, where we have a lot of diversity in language and also in dialects. Like Professor Paul said, that the language that we use, the technical terminologies and all, they're fantastic. But when it comes to communicating the language most people use in all Indian languages are almost similar. So it is almost similar to what we do in technical writing. Can we change that a little bit is the thing. There are some limitations. One of the limitations is the dialect. Now, when I write in Kannada, I think some of my Kannadigas are also here. Most of science writings are what is called as standardized Kannada. And this Kannada is the literary Kannada that we find in textbooks or in literary textbooks. And therefore, it is again a different technical language. It is not the language of the people. So therefore, one thing that we need to do is to go beyond this and get into the shoes of the commoners and try to understand how we can talk to them. Let me just give you one example of this. I usually go to the schools and talk to children, and also one school teacher asked me, so he had difficulties in teaching about nervous system to 10th standard students. So he asked my help. I said, okay, we'll go. And I took up the assignment, went there, stayed in a village for 5 days, and took up the lessons related to nervous system, and tried to teach them. The textbook has terminologies of a specific set, most of them derived from Sanskrit. Understandably, because using Sanskrit is easier to derive other words out of it. And therefore, that was the most important thing that happened. And I started talking to them, and I said, have you seen a model of Mastishka? Can someone bring the model of Mastishka from your lab? Everybody was just blank, sitting there, looking at me blank. I was in a tribal area. Most people would have seen a brain because they are all hunters, hunter-gatherers, and the children hunt a lot of birds and other things that is around. That is their livelihood also. And I presumed that they would have seen the brain, and therefore it is easier for me to talk to them from the brain. But they didn't understand this single word. Then I had to change back. I asked them, do you know Midulu? The Mastishka is a Sanskrit derived word. Midulu is a common shishta, that is the standardized text, like Dr. Paul said. And they said, again, blank stares. There was no response. Then I stopped there, had to engage the audience. Then I started some story and then said that, okay, he started liking Tale Midulu. Sorry, Tale Mamsa. Tale Mamsa is meat of the head. The response was totally different. The whole audience started engaging with me. And then instead of Mastishka, we started talking about meat of the head, which is what they call brain as. And then we compared different meat of the heads of different animals. And then we went to the meat of the head of the teacher, rather, or myself, or the humans. So the essential thing is, in communication, we need to understand our audience and then tune our language accordingly. Unless we do that, it is not possible to communicate with a good number of people. And this is one of the major drawbacks of science communication, because most of the write-ups in the newspapers or other media follow a standardized language. And if we can just go beyond that and try to reach out to the people, that will be much, much better. Again, I am only focusing on one question. How does this science communication in Indian languages help? Again, most people say that it is not of any use. But my experience is, even if there is one person who wants to understand something about science in Kannada, I should be able to communicate to him. Because what we do in a lab, we can easily talk to our colleagues. We can talk to our peer group. We can talk to our seniors. And we can also, to some extent, talk to the official authorities about what we do. But then what we are doing here is not easily understood by a lot of other people. One of my colleagues was working on microbiology. And she was not able to tell what she was doing with her mother. It was not possible for her to explain what she is doing. So it so happened that I was in Delhi, and during the winter time, we had to cook idlis. And it was the idli batter, is a fermented batter. That means we have a microbiological process going on in that. But then in the winter of Delhi, it doesn't happen naturally. So we'll have to add a few more things. Okay. When this lady's mother who was visiting, and she wanted to do this, she had a difficulty. She was not able to make the idli. So we suggested do it this way. Make the batter, and when it is warm, keep it in a thermocol box. At that time, we didn't have all this, the hot waste, what we call as, we didn't have the insulated waste at the time. So we put some straw and all these things and put some thermocol sheets and made a box and then put the batter in that. Next morning, the batter was very good and the idli could be made. The mother was surprised. How did it happen? The easiest explanation was to tell her that, what you're doing here is to ferment the yeast or the lactobacilli that's present in the, not exactly lactobacilli, but the bacteria that is present in the batter, and that needs specific temperatures, and that is why you could not cook it here. So how did you know all these things? Huh? Your daughter does the same thing in the lab. So this is how, unless you relate to your life's experience, this doesn't happen. But then science also throws a lot of challenges. A lot of concepts, like Professor Paul said, are created by us. Determinism is a concept, a definition of a process, of a happening, or of a phenomenon that we have given a specific word to that. This word which was not existent in our regular vocabulary. So how do we bring that concept into this? Either we have to relate it with a word, create a new word and relate it, or we can simply explain the concept also as it is. So these two methods are there. So what we do is, generally we follow the first method. First we try to explain the concept, then relate it to the word, and keep on reinforcing that particular word frequently in an article. Generally, this is a technique that I use, and this needs a little bit of creativity, because the editors are very fond of removing all the redundant materials, repetitive sentences, wherever it is there, repetitive concepts, they are there. So you must cheat them. You must make it in such a way that the repetitive concepts, repetitive explanations are they sound differently. They don't sound similarly everywhere. So once you do this, the concept can be reinforced in an article throughout. So these are some of the techniques, unconsciously or consciously we follow many of these. I must give you one more example of how one of my write-ups impacted in a different way. Long back, there was a geographer who visited India, and he came very close to my place in Kollegala. And we have a beautiful Hoysala temple here. The temples have wonderful architecture. Almost all Indian temples have wonderful architecture. And this is exquisite, because very fine carvings are there. And he came here, he visited it, but he didn't just go like that. He wrote a letter to nature, saying that what he saw in Somnathapura were the frescoes of maize. Remember, this temple was built in 1100 AD. So that means we are talking about a pre-Columbian era, before Columbus visited South America and brought maize to the Europe, the developed world. So it was something of a excitement, but it appeared in nature as only a small note, as a small letter, not even a letter, as a small note, as a news item. I picked it up, and because I picked it up mainly because it related to something very close to me, very nearby my town. So I went back to the temple, went around, looked at it, then looked at the literature, if anybody in India had talked about these things. I found that there were only one botanist who spoke about that, and who said these could be not, he never thought about the maize, it could be some other fruit. That's what he had said. So he didn't identify the fruit or anything like that, and it stopped at that. I was surprised, because the same author had written a lot of literature based on archaeological evidences, saying about the the import of lots of vegetables into Indian recipes. But this was something strange. So I wrote an article in Kannada for one of the popular magazines. The magazine asked me, how is it important that, just because it happened in 500 years before Columbus, how is it important? So I had to justify to them that this information is something new and it is not there anywhere. The second thing is, it shows that, yes, we must have had some contact. Somewhere that contact must have been there. So they were convinced, and the article was published. After this, a group of scientists from the University of Agricultural Sciences who read that article, they were thrilled. So they went back to that temple, looked at it. They took up a research project, a 5-year research project. And the conclusion was it must have been some different fruit. I still don't know whether it is maize or some other different fruit, whatever it is. But then look at this. A popular science article can always also affect a possible research. And how does that happen? It brings something that people usually may not be able to notice. So the popular science articles in Kannada or Indian languages are equally important, because there are many areas where the information that comes from various sources are important, and that's the thing that I find. The challenges, of course, are many. These days, there is one more challenge of what media should you use? How do you use the media? I used to write for a column for popular papers and newspapers and also magazines till about 2011 or something like that. Then something changed, something drastically changed, and that has affected all of us. So these medias are the print media or other media, which was independent at one time, are not so these days. They have either a bias towards specific issues concerning the society or even the science, or they are sort of a sponsored media. And I'm very consciously speaking about this. And this happened. So I was asked by people to follow a specific line of writing. I said, no, I will not do that. For me, science is important. And if I communicate science, I will only communicate science and its impact on the society. But never say that this impacts only one part of the society and excludes the other one. No, that is not possible for me to do. I stopped writing for those newspapers. But then, where do I go to communicate and talk about what I learn every day? Because if there is no space in this medium, it doesn't mean that science communication should stop. Science communication should happen in a larger interest of keeping the digital divide as small as possible. So I started doing it in various different ways. Took to blogs, took to web magazines, and now I run my own podcast every day, which is very popular. And science communication through podcast is a different ball game. Through audio is a different ball game, because here we have to be much more careful about the terminologies that we use and the message that it passes on. One example I can give you is recently we hear so many words with regard to the corona pandemic, including the word pandemic. Okay, many of these do not have an equivalent in Kannada. One of the words that I read today morning in a newspaper is comorbidities. Comorbidity is very easily, we can easily understand what a comorbidity is with regard to corona when we talk about that or when we read about that in English. But when you read about that in Kannada, what do? If you say comorbidities, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, for a totally Kannada understand person who doesn't have any other information. So comorbidities have to be explained, but then you don't have the space. So what they did was saha aswasthata. Okay, aswasthata is from Sanskrit, and saha is co. So we talk about this. A colleague is a sahayogi. A cooperation is sahakar. So saha is the phoneme that we add there, and that is the word that I saw. But then I cannot use that easily several times in my audio because it sounds very harsh on my ears, only especially in Kannada. So I will have to use some other word. So my way of doing this is, yes, we take all the lessons of coining new words with the different roots, almost all the things. So suppose we have 4 or 5 different types of words for the same oxygen. And if I am writing it in a text, I may use oxygen as it is. And even in Kannada, if it is simple, I can use oxygen. But if it is a very tough, difficult word to pronounce, then I will have to use an alternative which is easier to read. So this option we should be able to keep. Let anybody create any word about a concept. As long as it conveys that meaning, we should be able to use the Sanskrit rooted words or the other words. Why I'm telling you is maybe not in Bengali, but in Hindi, there is a specific group of people who would say that use only Sanskrit, don't use Urdu roots. Okay, this is there. Even in Kannada, this challenge is there, that people want to use only the words from Sanskrit roots rather than from Kannada roots. And there is another group which says that only use Kannada roots. So there are two dictionaries in Kannada which are totally different. And for a person who doesn't know both of them, the word, whether I use sahaswastata or saha roga or saha khaile, both are equally strange. So my choice would be a word which sounds better, which reads better, and which people can read easily. So that's the choice I do. So these are some of the points that I wanted to talk about. I think I will answer the questions. I'm not talking about how we have to write an article, that has already been discussed a lot. But what I want to emphasize is that writing in Indian languages is much more important than writing in English. That doesn't mean that writing in English is simpler. Writing popular science or communicating science to a non-science audience is equally difficult in English. Probably you have heard the keynote address of Professor Raghavendra Gadakar. So Raghavendra Gadakar writes a column in the Wire Science, and I translate that into Kannada and do that, and we publish it as a audio magazine in our podcast. And when we do this translation, especially when we read it out as an audio, it has to sound Kannada. It has to be like that. So we do this, a lot of exercise goes through this, and I would say that what reads wonderfully well in the Wire Science sounds equally good in Kannada also. A lesson that I learned again when doing this exercise was that I thought that this particular series of articles that Professor Raghavendra Gadakar is writing is specifically for students who are taking up graduate studies in or PhD programs. This Janasuddhi, the podcast that I produce, goes to 6 community radios also simultaneously. And 2 of the community radios told me that one of the popular programs of Janasuddhi is Professor Raghavendra Gadakar's article. Probably that is because he speaks about his experience, so people can relate it much more easier. So storytelling is an important aspect. The first lecture that was there was on storytelling. Storytelling is not actually writing a story. It is a technique. It is a technique. How do you say a thing to sound much more intimate than what it appears? Say, for example, if I say that there are I ate dosa, it will be a simple narrative statement. Okay, but I relished dosa is a story. Is a story. So this is the difference. So we can bring in this element of storytelling. It's not that Sharma went to canteen, he sat there, he looked at so many things and ate story. No, that is not storytelling. Storytelling is how do we make a statement, a concept, or a write-up intimate. And that is the thing. So there is a problem. So am I audible now? Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, probably my throat dried. It's okay. So this is the thing. Essentially, what I want to say is that writing science or talking about science or communicating science in Indian languages is not difficult. Please leave that around. The first thing that we need to do is to start doing it, and automatically it happens. So just, I would say, try, and we need more people to write, to speak, and to teach in Indian languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that insightful talk, Mr. Sharma. So next we will have Professor Nath, after which we will take questions. So Professor Nath, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to this panel discussion, first of all. It's very interesting to hear about Mr. Sharma's experiences in the Kannada medium. I wanted to talk about some challenges in science communication in regional languages, which may be specific to Bengali, but some of it may even apply to other languages in India. One of the biggest problems that I can think of is to find a platform. And the curious thing is that although there is a lot of demand, and general readers would tell you that they would like to see more pieces, science pieces in Bengali, for example, the number of newspapers or magazines and publishing houses which have dedicated space or trained science editors for the job is abysmally small. And what is even more curious is that this space has been shrinking over the years. I mean, if you go back to, say, Bengali magazines 50 years ago, you'd find that, for example, the magazine Desh had a regular column on science. The children's magazine Shandesh used to carry a feature on nature studies that has become legendary now. Other magazines, even little magazines, had science columns. And this has been the case for a long time, even in the 19th century in Bengal. But that's not the case now. Forget about regular columns. Magazines and periodicals are hesitant to put up science articles. Some would say that this is mainly because of the steady corporatization of media business. If you talk to a management person in media or publishing house, they will point out from various data analysis of readers' feedback that it's a waste of revenue to devote pages to science instead of, say, lifestyle, entertainment. This actually may be an illusion, and because the real sales figures of good science books in Bengali tells a different story, actually. But the ground reality is that there is a reluctance on the part of publishers and media. And it's not clear how we'll overcome this obstacle. For English writing and maybe for Hindi, various central government outfits like Vigyan Prasar may be able to counter this with new incentives, grants. But I doubt whether sufficient money will be diverted to regional languages. Another thing that has happened is that the Indian academia did not pay attention to science communication for decades. In fact, it was actively discouraged, with the hint that only people who don't do science well, they do science writing. And if you happen to be a good communicator, you are a suspect, because it must be because you don't do your science well. Otherwise, how else would you have found time? Of course, there have been notable exceptions, for example, Nalika, but this was more or less the rule. And this was the case everywhere. I mean, even Carl Sagan apparently suffered from such attitude in the mainstream scientific circles. But other countries realized the importance of science communication much before us. What's more, scientists often like to keep silent about political and social issues, maybe fearing retributions in the form of withdrawal of grants. But for example, when UGC suggested some years ago that astrology should be taught as a regular course, none of our science academies said a single word. In general, scientists have stopped being important in the psyche of general population. They become distant figures. And this has added to the vacuum of science communication by professional scientists that I mentioned. And in Bengali, now I may be wrong, but my impression is that this vacuum has given rise to a kind of science writing which is laced with gossip, who said what to whom, and juicy details of interactions between scientists without actually touching upon the main issues. And unfortunately, these writings have been mostly on the theoretical physics, mainly abstract ideas, where you can use your choicest hyperboles without understanding what has been written. So whatever space there was has been hijacked by a kind of fake science writing, I would say, that does not prod readers to think more, only give a fleeting impression of having read something grand, but if you ask them what it was, they won't be able to tell. And these science writers mainly write their stuff after reading up some English books, and urban readers have realized that they can access the original books, so they've moved away from reading Bengali books on science. And this may have given the false impression to the publishers that readers are not interested in science, reading science in Bengali anymore. Of course, there are exceptions, and Professor Pal here is a notable exception among a few others. But in general, I think I wonder that the hard work done over more than a century by Bengali science writers, including written by scientists, have we squandered it? And now, if you look at the general readers, they dread to read anything that is tagged science. So it's not without reason that this room for science writing in Bengali has shrunk. Now, internet has, I must admit, has opened up some avenues for creating new platforms. There are earnest webzines, websites dealing with science writing in Bengali, but this comes with the disadvantage of the lack of proper editing, which would have been available in not always, in normal ordinary media. And all this has created, I think, a disconnect in science writing between a few decades ago and now, both in form and content. I thought it was just me, but talking to my science writer friends in Bangladesh, I realized that this is a common problem. The main problem, I think, is that we don't have time to read extensively anymore. We prod our students to produce papers and not read much outside of what we call scientific literature. Also, the modern method of language education in schools leave the students ill-equipped with habit of writing, and writing in particular in Bengali. Also, for a lot of people in the professional scientific circles and students, English has become the de facto first language for various reasons. So all these factors have made us blind to the existing good work that has already been done, the rich heritage of science writing in Bengali, which is unique, by the way, in Indian context. And the recent surge in the science communication, now there is a lot of incentive, a lot of grant, a lot of recognition, etc., etc. It's produced an illusion of creating a new world without being aware of the existing edifice. I think we should read what has already been written in order to continue the existing threads. For example, I've been learning, discovering some very good science writings in Bengali in the last few decades. I mean, I live in Bangalore, so my job of trying to procure some of the books that I would really like to read, it's not an easy one. And I'm still learning that, tools of the trade. Now, there are some practical problems in not reading up on existing words. For example, with the technical terms. When a Bengali word is coined for a particular technical term that has become newsworthy, for example, initially there is a chaotic period when everybody tries out their own variant. Slowly it converges into one word, like the surviving gene in a gene pool. But now, suppose I start writing on a topic with the best intentions, but without being aware of what has happened in the past, and throw yet another new variant, then it will only confuse the readers, in whose mind some other word has gelled. Now, it's possible that a new writer has some real argument against using commonly accepted Bengali term, then one is most welcome to introduce a new one, but with the argument why it is better than the predecessors. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is that we should be aware of what has happened before we muddy the water unnecessarily. And I think the best recommendation is the same one that Professor Garakar gave in this workshop on the very first day, to read as much as possible. And that applies to Bengali science writing as well. I mean, he urged the students to read up on good popular science books by Richard Dawkins, Stephen Jay Gould, etc. And we should do the same for Bengali science writing. And for that, often we may have to go beyond the most well-known newspapers or periodicals with a larger circulation, for example, because sometimes the best writing in Bengali in science appears in platforms which are not targeted towards urban readers. I would even go to the extent of suggesting, that people who want to write for science may want to take up lessons in creative writing, for example. I have personally gained from that. There's not much time, so I'll mention a couple of things. In Bengali, there is an added dimension to the challenges. Professor Pal mentioned that in passing. It's a geographical or political dimension, you might say. And there's a lot of writing in science in Bengali from Bangladesh. And there's, I think, a disconnect there between writers on both sides of the border. Unfortunately, books from either side are not easily available, even though we are neighboring countries. And this gap widens the disconnect. And it would be a shame if we didn't gain from having a common language, and if the large number of Bengali writers, science writers, didn't enrich each other. And I wonder if the Bengali academies on both sides would take notice of this and maybe create a forum sometime for science writers on both sides to exchange ideas, maybe specifically on technical terms also. It also behooves us, I think, to be aware of the problems faced by science writers on the other side. For example, at this very moment, there is a problem of writing about evolution in Bangladesh, in Bengali, of using even the name of Darwin. And some writers are opting to use, instead of Bibortan, which is the standard word for evolution we use, they use Prakritik Poribortan. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I don't want to get into that debate, but I think we should be aware of this. This is a common problem, and we should treat this as a common problem. And finally, I think I would like to say one thing is that we're still talking about science communication in closed group, in academia. And we need to include the real masses. I mean, if you're serious about science communication with the masses, or at least the school teachers, we may write or create a content which we think it's good enough for the masses, but it may not be so. Sometimes, I mean, with the recent surge in the incentives and recognition in science communication in academia, sometimes I wonder whether we are writing to further our own careers and writing in platforms which are more visible and which are not really reaching out to the masses. And they may, it's possible that, I think the institutions, there should be some institutional support for this activity. And I'll give you one example, which there may be some others, but I know of one example which I liked very much. During the Science Day, the National Science Day, 28th February, every year, a lot of institutes, of course, hold exhibitions and different events. The one held in the giant meter wave radio telescope, which is about 80 kilometers away from Pune. It's in the village, Narangao. So the telescopes are placed in the field, in the farms. And they hold an exhibition, then an event with the different stalls. Thousands of people come from not just the neighboring village, from far away. This is an annual sort of an event in that area. And if you talk to the villagers even now, any other time, they would say, they're very proud of having this facility, which happens to be one of the largest radio telescopes in the world. And so I think there should be more such efforts with institutional supports if we want to really go to the masses. I mentioned these challenges not to discourage anyone, but I think it will do us good to keep these issues in mind, because all of us here are passionate about science writing in our own languages, and we'll do it anyway, come what may, whether there is any reward or not. But if we want to do this as a meaningful exercise, beyond filling up our own resumes with a long list of articles and books, and if we want to reach the lowest common denominator on the society, whom we must reach, and if we want the coming generation to look back upon us with some degree of respect at our work, then I think we should be aware of these issues. So thank you.
Ken, I have a comment to make.
Yes.
I think please go ahead. Aditya.
Yes, sir. Please do go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, I think Professor has spoken for me. Okay, Dr. Nath, thank you very much. All the problems that you said, the challenges, were real in my life, actually. So, though I was a scientist, I used to be communicating a lot, and therefore there was a lot of suspicion. So, fortunately, there was one advantage with me, because my name is too long. So, to make it simple for the people to understand, I shortened it into Kollegala, and which is not my name, and so the official name is different. So many of my colleagues who were not Kannadigas never knew about me, even Kannadigas. So that was one advantage I had, and I started writing, and I also fought with the establishment to say that yes, I keep on writing because I was not doing anything wrong. So I had to keep a few things in mind and do that, number one. Number two, as regards the media, yes, I already spoke about that. So the advantage now is what you have noticed in the present surge of science communication activities across India. Sometimes it scares me. Sometimes, it looks good that at least people are getting interested. But then the science communication should not be just limited to Twitter or to the Facebook. That's not the only thing. If we can do it, we will have to go beyond these media and do something. That's one. And the third thing is, I found that, I started doing the podcast. I don't get any funds. I'm still doing it. And every day it reaches about 4,000 people. And all that we do is, I have a 15-member team. Each of us spend some time every day. That's all. And many of the people spend only about 1 or 2 hours in a week. And we have been carrying this for the last 5 years. And the language and everything is, before I started this podcast, I even approached All India Radio that we can do a service like this, but they had their own limitations. So in a system where we have limitations, we can still work and do things. And I am the living example of that. If I have done something in spite of all these challenges, that means that it is possible. So like you said, you're not discouraging anybody, and I stand with you. We are not discouraging anybody in going ahead and doing this. These are the challenges, and providing a platform. Yes, Biman Prasar has recently started some exercises in various languages, including Bangla, of publishing a newsletter and all. In Kannada, yes, I am looking after that. It is called Kutuhali. We engage people in several different ways. We are now starting on a quiz that will start from June onwards, especially addressing teachers and challenging them. so that they start thinking in these directions. And these are some of the things that we can still do and is possible. The challenge today is don't look for a publication in the Wire, the Indian Express, the Times of India and all. So they have their own agendas. The best is have your own media, start your own blog, but keep these some essential things in mind, like the communication should be perfect, communication should be simple, and it should be science. That's it. Thank you very much.
Aditya, are you there?
Yeah. So
Please take over.
yeah, so thank you everyone for your wonderful talks. So I think we can now start the question Q&A session. So like I wrote on the chat, if anyone has a question to ask, then you can please use the raise hand function, and I will call you out. And yeah, okay. So Kevin, you can go ahead, and it would be nice if you could also specify towards which of the speakers your question is.
Yeah, I would like this to Sharma sir actually. So my question is, sir, you told that while you communicate science, you only communicate science. So it's actually a doubt. Like, so Professor Gadakar in his keynote address has quoted that he added this statement that while we communicate science, we should add flavors like flavors from history, politics, sociology, and philosophy, so that the readers, especially the lay audience, can have a very facile read. I mean, a very simple read, or they can get to know what the the reader wanted to convey correctly. So that will the real fact, by adding this essence, will make the writing so facile so that anyone can understand that. So do you agree that, sir? Like,
I
is that
100%
okay?
agree with that. I 100% agree with that. But then, see, when he says that you should add these elements, it doesn't mean that your science should not be there. Okay, you will only speak about politics and not about science. Okay, the politics should not overwhelm the science part of it.
Okay, sir, I have one more question with that.
Let me just finish. Okay,
Yeah.
the story elements that you add have to be supportive. Okay.
Yeah.
And there should not be a sort of a evaluation from your side, from the author. Yes, we are all humans. We have our biases. These biases should not come into this part. Okay, you leave it to the reader to judge and form his opinion. But of course, we have an agenda as science writers that we want people to convert to science. And when we do that, there will be slight bias towards science, slight bias, or what should I say, stress towards making science as a positive. That's it.
Okay, sir, and I have one more question regarding that.
The first question.
Excuse me, sir.
Can I make a point on the question that you just said? I would
sure.
use the word facile reading, because that means actually superficial reading. Actually, the goal of science communication should be otherwise. I wouldn't use the word. You can say easy reading, but not facile. I just wanted to make.
Yeah. So, like, the second question I have is, it's somehow related to the first question itself. So, if we are adding a kind of essence, so that to make the reading so easily. So, for example, if I am I just wanted to add some kind of historical examples or political examples. So, while I'm writing a vernacular kind of writing, so what kind of historic thing or political thing I should add with it, whether that related to that same region, or like I can take examples from. So since my writing is in a vernacular language, what kind of background, or what kind of examples, what kind of stories, whether that related to the same that locality, or so what kind of things I should add?
It will be fantastic if you can bring it out from your local flavors. Okay, that will be always good. Okay, the second thing is science is universal. The ball always falls to the ground, whether you are in India or whether you are in USA. Okay, so the examples can be similar in many of the cases. Okay, so that's not a difficult thing to do. Okay, if not apple, you can always say coconut.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where the flavors come. Number one. Number two is localization. It is possible. You look at, see, what are we talking about in science? In generally, when we start talking about science, we talk about common experiences and an understanding behind those common experiences through the methods of science. Right? So essentially, at the base of everything, whether it is physics, chemistry, or mathematics, you have something that is related to our day-to-day experience. So one has to read a lot to understand what is that, or do a lot of science to understand that. So Professor Raghavendra Gadadkar does it. So therefore, he knows that when I talk about this, I also understand this part of the society. So he brings both of them together. And if you read through all his essays that he recently wrote, there is sort of a allegory. Allegory in the sense is sort of a commentary about whatever is happening in our society today. Meanwhile, he doesn't say that, yes, this is my opinion. But what he says is that he talks about how science is done and how knowledge is acquired. But while doing that, he also subtly, for people who are intelligent enough to understand that, gives messages. And that is what he meant by easy reading. For a person who is not very serious about these things, it's easy reading. For a person who is very discerning, it is a very, very interesting and deep reading. And I agree with Professor Nath that facile doesn't mean that it will be something of a superficial thing. It will also have deep knowledge.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Anandarup Bhadra, you can go ahead and ask the question.
I have a question which is directed at any of the speakers who would pick it up. So it is about science communication in vernacular to children from schools. And you have mentioned in-person sessions with them and also institutional support. So could you suggest some way to do a good job of it in written form, not just in-person sessions, where there's an added problem that in vernacular languages, the children you'd be addressing have a lack of a reading habit. So how can we address that?
Yeah, I suggest you please go to storyweaver.org platform. Okay, storyweaver.org is a beautiful platform where a same story is told in multiple languages. Okay, and there is a specific orientation towards science. So you can write stories for children from kindergarten to 10th standard students, depending upon their age group. The story needs to be about 100 words, from 100 words to about 600 words. Please go through that. That's a beautiful example of communicating to children. That's one way. The second way is go meet them, talk to them. First, understand what questions they have and then do it. The third is what we are doing in our podcasts is that we have invited questions from the students. A lot of questions have been gathered, and each one of these questions is addressed to them. Means we get the answers from experts, put together explanations, and then give it to them. So these are many ways that we can do. But go, if possible, go and engage. In Karnataka, we have a system in the schools, what is called as Shalegge Banni Shanivara. That means please come to schools on every Saturday. So this is for the professionals who have weekends free, but the schools are running on Saturdays. So the professionals can spare their Saturday time and spend the time with the children. So this is a beautiful program that started, but again it petered out because of the lack of interest in the people who were running it, and the lack of awareness among the school authorities. But otherwise, it's a wonderfully conceived program, and I have been part of that for some time. But now I don't. I go on my own. Of course, now because of COVID, we are not going anywhere. But still, I engage teachers on online or WhatsApp or some way, do it.
Thank you, sir.
Bimanji has something to say.
No, I think you have said whatever.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Apeksha Srivastava, you can go ahead and ask a question.
So I had a general question which anyone of the speakers can take up. India is a land of diverse languages, and science communication is more prevalent in some than others. What could be some of the ways in which students and researchers can be explain the importance of science communication itself, so that science is able to have a much wider reach in the country?
Bimanji, can I answer?
Yes, please. I think you had already you mentioned some data, right? I mean, like how many % of people. So please go ahead.
Yeah, there are two things about this. You see, there are a lot of diversity within the language also. The Bengali language also has a lot of dialects. Similarly, Kannada language also has a lot of dialects. These also create some problems. Okay.
Yeah.
So my suggestion is, if you can look at the audio medium and use that audio medium to talk to them, okay, it will be beautiful. And that is one of the ways that you can do, and it is very simple. What we are trying to do here is to produce a podcast with a little bit of music, or using only our smartphones and a laptop, nothing else. There is no studio, there is nothing, no costly equipment, okay, and this is available for everyone. And you can produce sufficiently good quality audio using a simple microphone, or even a headset, and that should be enough. And you can speak about science whichever way you want. Tell a story, sing a song, or write about a news. Why not? So let's all be our own mediums.
In a similar manner,
Why I'm suggesting podcast is, this is an easy medium. Suppose you are coming from let's say a very remote northeast, or even Jammu and Kashmir, or maybe some part of Karnataka where the dialect is there. The advantage is you can speak in that particular dialect and communicate to them. Like I said, when you speak, you don't speak too much of technical words, so it becomes easier. The only thing that you have to remember is, like in all the sessions that you have already been told about how you can make a science story interesting using analogies, using local examples, and the local flavors. Yes.
Problem of the cultural problem that I mean that was pointed out long time ago by C.P. Snow in this famous book, the two cultures. That if you don't know what Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare is about, then you are considered somehow illiterate person. But if you do not know what Newton's second law is about, then it's okay. Those are hard things that people should not understand. So that hurdle somehow has to be crossed. I'm really not sure exactly how, but the way to start it is by telling the students. And when I'm saying telling the students, I'm not saying that only telling the students of science. You should also tell the students who are doing other things to read science. Give a book, give a present to them of a science book, and so on. So it should be the parents also are equally responsible. They are not interested in doing these things.
I think you are making a very important point, Palash, that we have to include the school. The school teachers should be included in this link of
Yes,
communication.
yes, yes.
Are very, very crucial. That's
Yes.
how we are going to reach the students who are not yet interested in science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, the teachers are the best links. And there is another problem, Dr. Paul. It's not just that people don't read science, because 60% of the students, according to my experience, cannot read and write well. And that is the difficulty, because the language teaching has been so poor.
Yes.
That a lot of students, even in DPS, for example, Delhi Public School, I have seen that almost 50 to 60% of students struggle to write and read, because our focus has been only towards the exams. And the language is taught as a subject, not as a communication tool. So these are the problems. Okay, we cannot solve those problems. So as science communicators, what we can do? What we can do is engage these people in whichever way you can. And what we looked at it is, because they are not able to read, can we reach science to them through audio? But then the teachers said, sir, we cannot, we don't have a studio and all. We provided an example saying that, look, you don't need, today the technology is so easy for everybody to handle, you can do it. When TikTok is there, everybody shoots a video, but when it comes to science, people say that no, it is a technology and we need a lot of technology. That is not the case. So the one thing is, we need to change our attitude first, that the science is only for us, science is only within the lab, and science is not understood by the people, and science is not interesting to the people. So if we change that attitude and try to make it a little more interesting to them, that will be fantastic. And that is what we try to do now. The teachers are also actively involved in science communication, at least in the group that we have been mentoring. It is possible.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I had one quick question in continuation to what Palash sir said. So do you agree, sir, that it would be easier to communicate with or convince children as compared to teachers or adults, since since children are more curious and tend to be more flexible, and most of us tend to develop certain biases and inflexibilities as we grow up, or is it not the case?
Let me see if I understand the question. You think, I mean, is the question that you are asking is whether it's easier to talk to children rather than talking with the parents or mentors?
Yeah, so easier to talk to them, communicate science to them, and convince them to communicate science to others.
These are two different levels of talking. I mean, you cannot talk to a children and ask the child to say that you buy a present in the school prize giving ceremony, because the children do not buy the books for prize giving ceremony. The teachers do. Okay, so there is a part of the work that the adult people will have to do. The second thing is the children will have to be taught why it is important to read outside the textbooks. Okay, so for example, everybody, well, almost everybody, or at least almost everybody at the time I grew up, read storybooks, right? Why? Nobody stopped us from reading storybooks. Well, if you are reading storybooks 24 hours, then somebody would, but that was not the case. And then also in the curriculum in school, you have a literature course where you read literature. Why do you read it? has never tried to, has anybody ever tried to explain it to anybody? You read it because there are all kinds of, well, or many kinds of experiences that you cannot have as a person in your life. So you need to read other people's experience, and sometimes not even real people's experience, to see how different people react in different kinds of situations. And that's important for your life. That's important for your growing up. Similarly, why is it important to read books outside textbooks in science? Because textbooks give you only the accepted, the final results or the final formulas. They do not give you how the formulas were attained. For example, we all read that Newton found that the gravitational force is 1 over r square. How did Newton find that it's 1 over r square? It was not given to Newton, right? Even that parable of the apple doesn't tell that it's 1 over r square. Newton certainly knew that it would fall with rising r. That's just common sense. But how did he know it's 1 over r square, not 1 over r cube, not e to the power minus r? Okay, so the way Newton reached these conclusions, that you cannot read in textbooks, that you have to read in the books that are normally called popular science. I mean, that use of the word popular is a vulgar use of the word popular. I mean, that's a very bad use of the word popular. Okay, but anyway, it's outside textbooks that you'll have to read it, and they give you a flavor of how science is done, how science is created, not just the created essence of the science which is given in the textbooks. So you'll have to tell people why they should read it, and this importance is not easy for children to understand always. So you will have to involve the adults also. So that is my answer to your question.
Yeah, so I should have, instead of children, I should have mentioned students. Like over the years, they should be not the very small children, but with time, things should be included in their curriculum so that they would be.
You did not understand. At my age, when I say children, it also includes you.
Okay, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
That includes me also.
Okay, so time is nearly up, unfortunately. So since there are no more hands raised currently, we can just wrap it up. But before ending, I would like to request everyone to switch on their cameras for a publicity photograph. Of course, if you mind it being on social media, then you don't have to switch it on at all. But otherwise, it would be nice if everyone could do so. Okay, so I'll count down from 3. So smile, everyone. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So thank you everyone for the wonderful talks, and I hope everyone enjoyed attending. With this, the session comes. We've reached the end of the session. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers and the moderator.
Thank you.